It was supposed to be a simple court hearing. But when a single dad walked in wearing a worn military coat and medals from another life, the judge laughed, and the room followed. What happened next, no one saw coming. Before we begin, if you believe in stories that honor quiet courage, lost dignity, and the power of truth, we invite you to subscribe to Soul Moment Story. Your support helps keep these powerful moments alive. Now let's begin. The Northwood County Courthouse stood like a forgotten relic, its stone pillars weathered by time, its brass nameplate dulled by decades of sun and rain. On that cold Wednesday morning, frost still clung to the corners of the window panes as Benjamin Dawson gently pushed the wooden door open and stepped inside, with his 11-year-old son Ethan by his side. Ben wore an old olive-green military service coat, not for show, but because it was the only warm thing he owned that still fit. Faded patches and a few tarnished medals clung to the left breast pocket, hanging not for pride, but as memory. He walked with quiet purpose, head high, yet humble, like a man who'd carried burdens heavier than most could imagine, and had long since stopped needing the world's applause. The courtroom was already half full. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of pew-like benches, a clerk to the left, the bailiff leaning back in his chair, and Judge Trent Alberson perched like a hawk above them all. Trent Alberson, mid-60s, stern-jawed, wearing his black robe like armor. He had served as a judge for nearly 2 decades and saw himself more as a keeper of order than a seeker of justice. To him, efficiency was virtue, and humility was a weakness he couldn't afford. Ben walked to the defendant's table, gently guiding Ethan with a hand on the boy's back. Ethan, thin and shy, clutched a folder against his chest, with a drawing of a flag he'd made for school. His wide eyes scanned the room nervously. Their case was minor, a traffic incident. Ben had swerved to avoid hitting a deer and grazed a parked sedan outside a grocery store. No one was hurt. But instead of paying a fine, he couldn't afford. Ben had chosen to appear in court to request leniency representing himself. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Alberson entered from the side door, his robe trailing like a cape behind him. As he took his seat and adjusted his glasses, his eyes landed on Ben. His gaze lingered not on the man's face, but on his medals. Alberson's lips curled. "Mr. Dawson," he said, voice amplified by the overhead mic. "We appreciate you dressing for the occasion, but this isn't a costume party." A few chuckles rose from the gallery. Ben didn't flinch. He simply nodded and spoke calmly. "This is my service uniform, Your Honor. It's all I have left that still fits." Alberson raised a skeptical brow, leaning forward. "Those medals, they real?" The room went silent for a beat. Ethan looked up at his father, confused. Ben's answer came slowly, measured, not defensive, but grounded in something deeper. They were awarded in places most people try to forget. "Your Honor," Alberson scoffed. "Right, and I suppose you have a Medal of Honor stuffed in your sock drawer, too." Laughter louder this time. A couple of spectators snickered. Even the bailiff cracked a grin. Ethan's small face flushed red. He tugged at Ben's sleeve. "Dad." Ben placed a calming hand over his son's and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "Let them laugh, son. Truth doesn't need applause." Claire Donovan, the public defender sitting 2 rows back, stiffened. She had seen many defendants disrespected in court, poor ones especially, but something about this felt different. She squinted at Ben's shoulder, noticing a faint insignia beneath the wear of fabric, a small eagle grasping a sword. Her eyes widened. Alberson cleared his throat dramatically. "Well then, Mr. Dawson," he said, tapping his gavel against the wood, "once we'll get started. And kindly remove that coat before we continue. I won't have distractions in my courtroom." Ben didn't move. "Your Honor," he said respectfully. "It's not to draw attention. It's all I have that's warm. We came here by bus this morning. It's 33 degrees outside." Alberson leaned back in his chair, irritated. "You're in contempt of courtroom decorum." Claire stood now, interjecting cautiously. "Your Honor, with all respect, there's no statute barring a defendant from wearing a military uniform in court." If anything, Alberson cut her off with a raised palm. "Miss Donovan, you are not this man's counsel." "No," Sir Claire replied, "but someone should be." Ben turned to her, giving a faint smile of gratitude, but shook his head. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I'll speak for myself." Alberson turned back to Ben, clearly agitated by the show of defiance, or what he perceived as such. "Then let the record show this court has made note of the defendant's inappropriate attire and disruption." Ethan clenched his fists. His father had taught him that dignity wasn't about looking proud. It was about standing tall when others tried to make you feel small. Ben said nothing more. He simply straightened his posture, hands gently folded, like a soldier awaiting orders he already knew he could handle. For a brief moment, the courtroom went quiet, not out of respect, but confusion. They didn't know what to do with a man who refused to beg, who didn't lash out, who didn't fold. And perhaps they didn't quite know what to do with the look in his son's eyes, a mix of fear, admiration, and something else entirely unshakable belief. Claire sat back slowly, her eyes still fixed on the insignia. She didn't believe in coincidences, and something about Benjamin Dawson was clawing at the back of her mind, like a memory refusing to be forgotten. Up on the bench, Judge Alberson flipped through his docket already bored, but the wheels had begun turning not in the courtroom, but far beyond it, and no one, not even a judge with a gavel and a sneer, could stop what was coming next. The courtroom clock ticked just past 10:03 a.m. Judge Trent Alberson reclined slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing. His irritation from earlier had only deepened. Something about Benjamin Dawson's calm defiance, his unwillingness to play the game of shame, was rubbing Alberson raw. He had seen arrogance in his courtroom before, but never in such a quiet, deliberate form. Alberson didn't know what to make of it, and that unsettled him. He leaned forward and spoke with the sharp edge of faux authority, masked as legal decorum. "Mr. Dawson," he said. Voice echoing through the hushed courtroom, "You were instructed to remove your military coat. This court does not allow theatrics." Ben sat upright, composed. "With respect, Your Honor, I've explained that this coat isn't for theatrics, it's for warmth, and I wore it today, as I would any other day, with respect." Alberson raised his chin. Respect. Wearing unverified medals in a courtroom is not respect. It borders on impersonation. That is a federal offense, you know. A few murmurs rose from the back rows. Ethan flinched. Ben's voice stayed level. "I'm not impersonating anyone, sir. Those medals were given to me. I wear them not to prove anything, but because they remind me of those who didn't make it home." Alberson leaned back, visibly enjoying the growing tension. "You expect this court to believe that I don't expect anything," Ben said quietly. "I came here to resolve a traffic citation, not to argue about the past." But Alberson wasn't ready to let it go. Not now. Not when the room was watching. Not when a man dared to challenge his authority with civility instead of fear. "You will either remove that jacket, Mr. Dawson," Alberson said, "or I will hold you in contempt of court." A few heads turned. Someone let out a quiet gasp. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's small hand reached up and tugged on his father's sleeve. Ben looked down at his son, then back up at the judge. Then, with measured care, he stood. He unbuttoned the olive-green coat slowly, not defiantly, but deliberately. Each button sounded louder than the last, a heavy, silent protest against the humiliation unfolding. He folded the coat neatly, medals facing inward, and placed it on the table beside him. Underneath, he wore a faded gray button-down shirt and slacks, just slightly too big. Alberson smirked. Much better. Now we can proceed like civilized people. Ethan suddenly stood up. The boy's voice trembled not with anger, but heartbreak. "My dad is civilized," he said. "He's more decent than anyone I've ever met." The room froze. Alberson's gavel slammed down with a hard thunk. "Sit down, young man." Ethan turned toward the judge, but before he could say anything more, Ben gently reached out, placing a calming hand on his son's shoulder. "Ethan," he said softly, "it's okay." "But it's not, Ethan," whispered, barely holding back tears. "You didn't do anything wrong." Ben knelt beside him, eye to eye, voice low but steady. "Son, sometimes people say things they don't understand. But if we let their anger steal our peace, then they win twice." Claire Donovan sat frozen in the back of the courtroom, her heart tightening in her chest. This wasn't just another low-income defendant trying to squirm out of a fine. There was something deeper happening here, something that smelled like truth, buried beneath pride and silence. Alberson cleared his throat, visibly annoyed that his power had been momentarily eclipsed by a father's grace. "Mr. Dawson," he said harshly, "you are now being held in contempt of court for disrupting proceedings. A $500 fine will be issued effective immediately." Claire stood abruptly. Your Honor, Alberson raised a hand to silence her. "You are not his counsel." "Yes, sir," she replied, voice firm. "But I request to become such pro bono. Immediately." Alberson scowled but didn't stop her. Ben looked over, surprised. Claire walked to the defense table standing beside him. "If you'll allow me to assist Mr. Dawson," she said gently. "I'd be honored." Ben hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Ethan sat down, quietly gripping the coat his father had folded. His small hands ran over the medals beneath the fabric, as if trying to protect them from the eyes of the world. Claire turned back to Alberson. "Your Honor, I move to object to the contempt ruling." The defendant remained respectful throughout. His son spoke out of turn, not him. The record will reflect that. Alberson's jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a woman in her 30s, with a voice that carried more weight than his gavel in that moment. "Noted," he said tightly. "But the fine stands." Ben exhaled, his voice calm. "Your Honor, I've paid higher prices for less just causes. This one, I'll pay standing." The courtroom fell silent. Even the hum of the light seemed to dull. Claire turned to him, unsure whether to speak or simply let the weight of his words settle. Ethan looked up from the coat face, now still. In his lap, he held a small, laminated photo of his father in uniform, taken long ago, when the world still treated his father like a hero instead of an inconvenience. He looked at the judge with young eyes filled not with hate, but disappointment, the kind that wounded deeper. He said nothing else that day. Neither did Ben. And in their silence, they carried more truth than anyone else in that room could bear to speak aloud. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a door slamming shut on fairness. "Mr. Dawson, Judge Trent Alberson said, adjusting his glasses with a performative sigh, "This court hereby finds you in contempt. A fine of $500 will be imposed immediately. Failure to pay will result in detainment until such payment is made." The clerk typed the words mechanically, her fingers moving faster than her expression could process the absurdity. Benjamin Dawson stood motionless. He didn't raise his voice or protest. The silence he carried had weight, a silence that came from seeing men fall beside him without a sound. Ethan's small hand gripped the sleeve of his father's shirt. "Dad," he whispered, "we don't have that kind of money." Ben smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't joy, but steadiness. "I know, son." He turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, I respect this court's authority. I only ask that the record reflect that my intent was never to cause disturbance or disrespect." Alberson waved a dismissive hand. "Intent is irrelevant. Consequence is what matters here. This court doesn't tolerate grandstanding, especially not from men who hide behind borrowed honor." The words hung in the air like poison. Ben took a slow breath, his eyes locking with the judge's. "Borrowed honor," he repeated softly. "You think those medals were borrowed?" The judge didn't answer. "I've buried men who earned less recognition than I have." Ben continued, his voice low and firm. "And they'd give anything to be sitting here instead of lying under a folded flag." For a moment, just when even Alberson's confident mask cracked, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But pride was a powerful thing. It wouldn't let him yield. "Mr. Dawson," he said sharply, "you're treading very close to another charge. Do you wish to spend the night in a cell?" Ben held his gaze for a beat, then looked away. "No, Your Honor." Claire Donovan, standing at his side, clenched her pen until her knuckles went white. She had defended hundreds of cases, many hopeless. But never had she seen quiet dignity provoke so much cruelty. She leaned closer, whispering, "Let me appeal the contempt. It's procedural overreach. You don't deserve this." Ben shook his head lightly. "Don't waste your breath on pride, Ms. Donovan. It's his courtroom." Ethan tugged again at his father's sleeve. His voice quivered. "Why is he being so mean?" Dad Ben crouched slightly so his son could hear him without raising his voice. "Because, son, some people mistake power for respect. But they're not the same thing." Alberson's gavel struck again, more to reassert control than to give order. "Enough whispering. You've wasted this court's time long enough." The bailiff stepped forward. Claire rose her tone, still professional but edged with conviction. "Your Honor, I'll be submitting a motion to suspend the contempt penalty until review. The defendant's behavior has not met the threshold for contempt under Title 18, Section 401 of the U.S. Code." Alberson's nostrils flared. "Miss Donovan, you can file whatever papers you wish, but in this courtroom, my interpretation of respect is what matters." She met his stare, unflinching. "That's exactly the problem." For a split second, a murmur of approval rippled through the benches. A few veterans sitting in the back, men who had recognized the way Ben stood. The way he folded his coat, nodded quietly. Alberson pounded the gavel once more. "Bailiff, escort the defendant to payment processing. This hearing is adjourned until further notice." The room began to stir. Chairs scraped. Papers rustled. But Ethan sat, frozen eyes glistening. "Dad," he whispered, "are we really going to jail?" Ben bent down his voice, gentle, steady as stone. "No, son. We're going to walk out of here with our heads up. That's what soldiers do." He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, then turned to Claire. "Thank you for trying." "You didn't have to." "I did," she said softly. "You reminded me why I became a lawyer." Ben gave a faint nod. "Then we both did what we were meant to do today." They started toward the exit. The bailiff followed but hesitated. Even he looked uneasy, enforcing the judge's order. The veterans in the back stood silently as Ben passed a quiet salute of solidarity. Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with melted frost. The morning sun had broken through gray clouds, casting a pale gold over the stone. Ben stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air. Ethan looked up at him. "Dad, does this mean people think you're lying about being a soldier?" Ben turned, crouched again so they were eye level. "Some people, maybe. But truth isn't a thing you prove with medals, son. It's something you live with every day." Ethan blinked back tears. "But they laughed at you." Ben smiled, tired but warm. Let them. They only saw a man in an old coat. They didn't see what that coat carried. Claire caught up with them on the steps. Her expression was part anger, part admiration. "You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen," she said. "But I'm not letting this go. The judge's behavior was out of line. I'm filing a judicial complaint first thing tomorrow." Ben looked at her, studying the determination in her face. "That's kind of you. But you'll just make enemies for doing the right thing." Claire shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. Ben chuckled softly. "Then you'll do fine in this world." Ethan clutched the folded coat tighter in his arms, holding it like it was part of his father's heart. The small metals inside made a faint metallic sound, like wind chimes caught between memory and meaning. Down the steps, the courthouse flag waved lazily against the wind. Ben paused and watched it for a long time. The last time he'd saluted one like it, a casket had been loaded onto a plane. He stood straighter. Then he turned to Ethan. "Come on, kiddo. Let's go get some lunch before the world finds another reason to judge us." As they walked away, Claire stayed behind, watching them disappear down Main Street. Something about the man haunted her, the way he carried his silence like a weapon, the way even humiliation couldn't bend him. She pulled out her phone and typed his name into the legal database. Benjamin Dawson. No prior convictions, no active service records accessible, but under military background, one note flashed. Red. Classified DOD clearance level Omega. Her heart skipped a beat. Claire stared at the screen, whispering to herself, "Who are you?" Ben Dawson. Claire Donovan had sat through hundreds of hearings over the past 5 years. She'd seen teenagers mouth off to judges, war veterans beg for mercy, single mothers plead for their children, and she'd become good at not letting any of it break through her professional shell. But today felt different. She paced the narrow hallway outside Courtroom B, her heels clicking against the waxed tile like a metronome of urgency. Her mind replayed every moment of the hearing, the stillness in Ben Dawson's posture, the sharp edge of pain in his son's voice, the quiet resolve that never once flared into anger. And then there was that insignia. She hadn't seen it in years, a silver eagle grasping a downward sword set against a black shield. Most people would have missed it. To them, it was just a patch on a worn jacket. But Claire had a brother who'd served in Army intelligence. He used to show her subtle things. And that insignia wasn't decorative. It was Delta Force. But something was off. Even with all her access as a public defender, Claire had never seen a Delta vet end up standing alone in front of a judge. No representation, no defense fund, no Veterans Affairs paperwork. Nothing. Back in her office, she sat down at her computer and logged into the state records database. Typing fast, she entered Dawson Benjamin DOB, unknown Northwood County military affiliation. Any no results. She tried again this time, broadening the scope to state and federal databases. Nothing. No enlistment. No discharge. No VA benefits. Not even a parking ticket before today. Claire narrowed her eyes. That wasn't normal. She reached for her phone. "Come on, Mark," she muttered, scrolling through her contacts. Mark Bishop had been her brother's old roommate, now a mid-level JAG officer, based at Fort Lewis, about 40 miles away. He owed her a favor. Actually 3. The phone rang twice. "Claire, haven't heard your voice since my last wedding disaster." "Hey, Mark, I need you to do something for me," she said. Her tone was all business now. "Off the record," he chuckled. "Why does that not surprise me? What are you chasing this time? A man named Benjamin Dawson. He appeared in court today, wore an old green coat with a Delta insignia. There was a pause on the other end. Too long. Mark. You sure about the name?" "Yes. Benjamin Dawson. He had a kid with him. 11, maybe. I checked the usual systems. He doesn't exist. Another pause. Then Mark's voice dropped low. Claire, I can't help you with this. You can't or you won't. I mean it. Walk away. She frowned. He's being penalized for a contempt charge because he wouldn't take off a coat. His son's being humiliated. This man served Mark. He deserves better. Mark sighed. Listen carefully. Some names aren't supposed to show up. If this guy's file is sealed, it's not because of red tape. It's because it was buried. Claire blinked. Buried by who? A third pause. Then something in Mark's tone changed. No longer the joking college buddy, but a soldier. Claire, repeat the name exactly as it was given. Benjamin Dawson. Silence. Then a breath. Stay where you are. Don't talk to anyone else about this. I'll call you back in 15 minutes. The line went dead. Claire stared at the screen in front of her cursor blinking in the search bar. Her heartbeat had quickened, but she didn't know if it was from fear or instinct. She leaned back, scanning the notes she had jotted down during the hearing. I've paid higher prices for less just causes. Truth doesn't need applause. The man hadn't flinched when fined, hadn't protested when accused, but there had been fire in his eyes when the judge questioned his honor. And that fire wasn't theatrical. It was earned. 15 minutes stretched into 20. Claire tapped her pen against the desk, her eyes darting to the door every time someone passed. Finally, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then picked up. Hello, this is Captain Lane from Fort Lewis Operations Command. The voice was clipped serious. Are you the civilian who spoke with Officer Bishop regarding Benjamin Dawson? I am, Claire replied, sitting upright. You are to remain at your current location. A representative from this office will meet you within the hour. Do not attempt to contact Mr. Dawson again. Is that understood? Claire felt her breath catch. Why the line went quiet. Then calmly, the officer said, because the name you gave us just triggered Protocol Trinity. And ma'am, that's not something we take lightly. Click. The call ended. Claire sat frozen. She had no idea what Protocol Trinity meant, but it didn't sound like a courtesy call. It sounded like a siren behind the curtain, a secret the government kept locked behind steel doors and silence. But one thing was clear. Benjamin Dawson wasn't just a veteran. He was someone the military still remembered, and not just remembered, but protected. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the office window, where the American flag fluttered outside. For the first time in years, Claire felt something stir in her, the same thing she felt when she passed the Arlington headstones during law school, or listened to tapes of Nuremberg trials to study moral law. A quiet conviction. Some truths weren't meant to be hidden, and some men didn't wear their medals for show. They wore them for the dead. Judge Trent Alberson leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the coffee in his chipped "Justice Never Sleeps" mug. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but he stayed basking in the silence like a king surveying his kingdom after battle. He didn't regret the contempt charge. If anything, he was proud of it. The courtroom was a sacred space, and Benjamin Dawson had brought the stink of self-righteousness into it, draped in moth-bitten glory. Veteran Alberson muttered under his breath, scoffing. They all say they're veterans. Slap on some garage sale medals and think the world owes them. He clicked open his laptop, typing Dawson's name into the court management system again, as if daring it to prove him wrong. No priors, no employment record, no military verification on file. Just as I thought, he murmured. Behind the double-paned window, the early afternoon sun struggled through a smear of gray clouds. The light cut across the polished bench, casting long shadows toward the gallery. Shadows that didn't move, didn't speak, and certainly didn't challenge his authority. But outside that carefully curated silence, not everyone was at peace. Downstairs, District Attorney Thomas Reed sat alone in his office, a legal pad open in front of him, but untouched. He stared at the contempt fine order, flipping it over once then again. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. He remembered the man's voice, calm, centered, without a trace of sarcasm or instability. Reed had prosecuted hundreds of cases in his career. He knew when someone was playing the system, bluffing, or grandstanding. But Dawson didn't speak like a fraud. He spoke like a man who had seen too much, not too little. Reed pulled up the courtroom footage from that morning, raw, unedited. He watched the exchange again. The boy's trembling voice. Dawson's stillness. The moment he folded his coat with careful precision, as if laying something sacred to rest. There was a kind of dignity in it that made Reed uncomfortable. Because dignity like that, it doesn't come from acting. It comes from endurance. He leaned back, slowly rubbing his temple. What if we're the ones making the mistake? Back in Ben's apartment, a small one-bedroom above a shuttered auto repair shop, Ethan sat on the floor with a pencil and a wrinkled spiral notebook. He was supposed to be doing math homework, but instead he was sketching. He drew a courtroom bench just like the one from this morning. In it, he placed a tiny stick figure version of his father, standing tall, while behind him loomed oversized shadows shaped like gavels and question marks. Above it, he wrote in big block letters, "I believe my dad." Ben stood quietly in the doorway, watching. He didn't interrupt, just let the moment hang there heavy and soft. Ethan finally looked up. "Why don't they believe you?" Dad Ben crossed the room and sat beside him on the floor, stretching his long legs with a quiet groan. Because he said gently, "Sometimes the world forgets what real honor looks like. It gets distracted by noise, by uniforms that shine more than they serve." Ethan frowned. "But your medals are real. They are. But to some people, a medal only means something when they give it to you, not when you've earned it quietly." He looked down at his son's drawing, touched by the rawness of it. "You know," Ben added, "when I was your age, I thought people in charge always did the right thing. Judges, generals, presidents." Was it true? Ben smiled faintly. Some did. Some forgot how. Some never knew. Ethan nodded, as if filing that away somewhere important. Then he asked, "Are we going to fight back?" Ben paused, then reached over and gently took the drawing from the floor. He folded it once, then again, carefully, like he did his coat. "We already are," he said. "Just by telling the truth." Inside the courthouse, Judge Alberson clicked his pen twice, pulled up a new browser tab and typed, "Stolen Valor Prosecution Precedents." He was building a case in his head, even though no one had asked him to. In his view, he had just caught a man mid-lie, and now it was his duty, no, his right, to expose him. He didn't notice the bailiff pass by and hesitate at the door, then decide against knocking. He didn't notice the file marked "Confidential." Dud slid into his inbox 2 hours later with a red restricted tag, only to be immediately pulled back by IT before he could open it. He didn't notice that his name had already been flagged by a quiet inquiry at the Pentagon, asking why an inactive Delta Force veteran's court appearance had been logged with mockery of service in the notes. Alberson was too busy practicing his closing speech, the one he would deliver when he ruled against Ben again next week. He imagined the headlines, "Firm Judge Draws Line Against Courtroom Manipulation, Alberson Stands, Tall Against Stolen Valor." Claims power had always tasted like justice to him, even when it reeked of something else. But outside that insulated world of robes and reverence systems were beginning to wake up. Back in Fort Lewis, General Dana Brooks stood in a soundproof war room, arms folded, staring at the paused image of a man on a courtroom camera, tall, worn, dignified. A boy sitting beside him. Ben Dawson. A name she hadn't heard in nearly 20 years. A man she owed her life to. A ghost the military had buried beneath layers of security clearances and operational silence. She turned to her aide. "Where's the judge located Northwood County, ma'am? About 42 minutes by air. Alert the pilot. Tell the secretary I'll be off-grid for the next few hours." The aide blinked. "You're going there personally," Dana's voice was cool steel. "If I don't, they'll bury him again. But this time, it won't just be the military that's guilty." She stared at the screen again, her voice low. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted peace. And they humiliated him in front of his child. Her hand reached instinctively toward her chest, touching the ribbon hidden beneath her uniform, one she never wore in public, because he had been the one who earned it. And now she whispered, "We give him back his name." Ethan Dawson sat alone at the back of his fifth-grade classroom, the late afternoon sun pouring across the floor in long golden streaks. Outside, autumn leaves skittered along the sidewalk in the wind, but inside room 12B of Northwood Elementary, the air was heavy, the kind of heavy that settles when you've been laughed at, when the whispers follow you through the hallway like shadows that won't leave. His dad got in trouble in court. He's not even a real soldier. He wore fake medals. I saw the video. The judge told him to take off his coat like he was nobody. They didn't say it to Ethan's face. They didn't have to. Kids were masters at cruelty without confrontation. The clip had spread faster than wildfire. Someone's parent had recorded the courtroom proceedings on their phone and uploaded it with the title, "Man Pretends to Be Soldier, Judge Calls Him Out." Ethan hadn't even watched it. He didn't need to. He'd lived it. He sat quietly at his desk, pretending to work on a math worksheet he couldn't focus on. The numbers blurred. The silence was louder than noise. Mrs. Langley, his kind-eyed teacher, had noticed. She'd always liked Ethan. He was polite, thoughtful, never disruptive. But today he was ghostly quiet, his shoulders hunched just slightly, not in fear, but something harder to define, like he was carrying something no child should. She knelt by his desk and whispered, "Ethan, honey, if you need a break, you can go sit in the reading nook." Ethan nodded, grateful for the excuse to be invisible. He walked slowly to the back corner of the room, a cozy little alcove filled with beanbags and paperbacks, and pulled his backpack into his lap. From the side pocket, he took out a folded photo, his dad younger in uniform, standing tall beside a group of tired, muddy soldiers. No smiles, just the quiet pride of people who survived something together. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he took out a black marker from his pencil case, opened his math notebook to the inside cover, and began to write. Slowly, carefully. In thick, bold letters, "I believe my dad." Below it, he taped the photo. The gesture wasn't loud. It wasn't meant to be. But it was permanent. When recess came, Ethan left the notebook open on his desk. He didn't hide it. He didn't explain it. By the time he returned, 3 kids had seen it. One of them, a tall boy named Marcus, who'd laughed the loudest earlier, looked confused, even a little ashamed. He didn't say anything, but he stopped laughing. And that was a start. That evening at home, Ben was in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup over their aging gas stove. The place smelled like thyme and potatoes, not much, but enough to feel warm. Ethan sat at the small table sketching again this time, drawing a courtroom scene. Only now the judge's bench was empty, and his dad stood center stage, holding his folded coat like a flag. Ben turned, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What's that, buddy?" Ethan hesitated, then turned the paper around. Ben took it in the shading, the small medals drawn with detail only a son would notice. "That's powerful," he said softly. "Where'd you get the idea?" Ethan shrugged. "Just wanted people to see what I saw." Ben crouched down so their eyes met. "You know," he said, "sometimes being quiet doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're letting the truth do the talking." Ethan nodded, then added quietly, "They think you lied, Dad." Ben didn't flinch. "Some will always think that. But you know what matters. Ethan looked up. That you don't. The boy swallowed hard and nodded again. I made something at school today. For you. He went to his backpack and returned with the notebook, placing it gently on the table still open to the inside cover. Ben read the words slowly. Then he saw the photo, the one Ethan had taken from his old box of mementos last year when he was working on a school project. Ben's throat tightened, not with sadness, with something older, something sacred. He looked at his son, who suddenly seemed older than 11. "Thank you," he whispered. They ate in silence that night, the good kind, the kind that says, "I'm proud of you," without needing to say it. At school the next morning, Ethan carried the notebook with him. He didn't plan on showing anyone. He just wanted it near. But during lunch, Mrs. Langley pulled him aside. "Ethan, can I talk to you for a second?" He followed her to the hallway. "I saw what you wrote," she said gently. "And I just wanted you to know I believe your dad, too." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. She smiled warmly. "My brother served in Iraq. He used to say that real heroes never talk about what they did. They just keep trying to live right." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your dad sounds like one of those people." That night, Ethan told Ben what she said. Ben listened, then smiled. "She's right about one thing." "What's that?" "That living right is the only uniform we never take off." Somewhere in the distant sky, the blades of a helicopter began to spin. General Dana Brooks stood on the tarmac, helmet in hand, eyes locked on the horizon. In her chest pocket was a printed copy of Ethan's notebook. Cover someone at Fort Lewis had forwarded the image from a school bulletin board. How it reached them, no one quite knew. But it had. And it spoke louder than any courtroom transcript ever could. As the chopper lifted off, Dana looked down at the picture again and whispered, "He's not alone." The coded words scrolled across the secure monitor in the basement operations room of Fort Lewis, Protocol Trinity. Initiated subject, Dawson Benjamin E. Status. Omega classified. Field Commander Honor. Class authorization override required. Janorn Brooks D. Inside the war room, red lights pulsed softly. There were no alarms, no sirens. The kind of emergencies handled here didn't require volume, just precision. At the center of the room stood General Dana Brooks, her 4-star insignia gleaming subtly beneath the crisp lines of her uniform. She didn't blink as the technician handed her the tablet. "He's resurfaced," the tech said quietly. "Northwood County. Traffic court. Civil citation. Open hearing. Uploaded video already circulating online." Donna didn't answer. She stared at the image frozen on the screen, Benjamin Dawson standing in a cramped courtroom beside a thin boy with a heart too visible in his eyes. The photo meant nothing to most. But to her, it was everything. 21 years ago, Dana had been a young captain pinned down in Fallujah, trapped beneath a collapsed stone wall after an IED tore through their convoy. 3 soldiers were dead, 2 others bleeding out. She'd lost consciousness for 37 seconds. When she came to, the first thing she saw was him. Dawson. He wasn't even supposed to be there. His unit had completed their operation the night before. But he'd stayed back, instinct, he said later. Or maybe divine timing. He pulled her from the rubble with his bare hands, carried her across a field of fire, radioed a medevac under heavy shelling, then went back for the others. He didn't speak much, just moved like the war had already burned every unnecessary word out of him. She never forgot that look in his eyes, calm, calculating, unbreakable. When the mission was classified and buried, so was he. Dana had tried to reach out years later, but he was already gone, vanished from the system, discharged under sealed conditions. Some said he'd refused a promotion. Others whispered he'd testified against a high-ranking official during a covert inquiry. The truth was buried in so many layers of red tape, even she couldn't reach it. Until now. Until Northwood County Courtroom B. She turned to her aide. "Have we contacted the secretary?" "Yes, ma'am. You have full operational discretion. They'll deny knowledge if asked, but you're clear to proceed." And the judge, Trent Alberson, State Bench, known for conservative rulings and hostility towards self-represented defendants. No military service. Of course not. Dana thought. No one who had worn the uniform would speak to another veteran the way Alberson had. No one who had buried a comrade would ever mock the weight of a medal. She moved to the center table where a large satellite map of Northwood glowed softly. With a swipe, she highlighted the courthouse, then the nearby police station. Then, paused. "Find the boy," she said. "Ethan Dawson." Donna nodded. "Yes. I want eyes on him discreetly. Not surveillance respect. He's a child, not a target. But we don't let any harm near him. Understood." The aide swallowed. "Understood, General." Dana's voice dropped lower. "And notify Arlington. Let them know the man who saved half a squadron is being publicly humiliated for wearing what he earned." While the gears turned quietly in Fort Lewis back in Northwood, the courtroom was already preparing for the continuation of Ben Dawson's hearing. Judge Alberson reviewed the docket in his chambers, blissfully unaware that his jurisdiction had just entered the orbit of national defense. He sipped lukewarm coffee, making a note to push back on Claire Donovan's motion to vacate the contempt charge. It was poorly argued in his view, emotional idealistic. He didn't like lawyers who led with their hearts. They made a mess of order. What Alberson failed to understand, what he never could, was that order built without justice was a house of cards in a windstorm. Down the hall, Claire Donovan sat at her desk, heart pounding. She hadn't heard back from Mark Bishop, and her messages had gone unanswered since the cryptic call yesterday. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something massive, and yet every door she knocked on had gone quiet. Still, she wasn't one to wait. She opened her laptop and drafted a motion to transfer the case out of Alberson's courtroom, citing conflict of interest and bias. It was a long shot, but it put pressure on the system, and sometimes pressure was the only way to make bureaucracies blink. She also began drafting a judicial complaint. Every word she typed echoed with what she saw in Ben's eyes that day, not helplessness, restraint. The kind only forged in combat or catastrophe. And when she paused to stretch, she looked again at the grainy photo someone had sent her, the one of General Dana Brooks stepping into a Black Hawk at Fort Lewis. The caption was cryptic: "Operation Trinity, 0600 departure confirmed." Claire narrowed her eyes. Something was coming. She didn't know what or who, but she felt it in her bones. Back at Ben's apartment, Ethan was asleep on the couch, his notebook still in his lap, his fingers clutching the corner like it was a blanket. Ben sat beside him, lost in thought. He hadn't expected this storm. He'd tried to disappear to serve to atone to father a child in peace. But peace was a luxury the world never guaranteed. He looked down at his son brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "I tried to shield you from all this," he whispered. "But maybe the world needs to see you." The knock at the door came just after midnight. Ben opened it slowly. A woman in uniform stood there, silhouetted against the hallway. Light 4 stars glinting face-sharp with memory. "Hello, Ben," she said. "It's been a long time." Ben exhaled slowly. "Donna." She stepped inside without waiting for permission, not out of arrogance, but out of trust, earned on the battlefield. "I saw the hearing," she said. "And I saw the boy." Ben looked down. "He doesn't deserve this." "No," Dana replied. "But maybe this is what brings the truth into the light." She opened the case she carried inside was a sealed envelope marked Department of Defense. Clearance level Omega. Dana looked up, her voice quiet but commanding. It's time, Ben. They mocked the wrong man in the wrong courtroom. And tomorrow, they're going to learn who you really are. The courtroom was unusually full for a midday civil hearing. Spectators filled every wooden bench, their murmurs hushed, but palpable. Some were curious townsfolk, drawn in by the online video. Others were veterans wearing worn leather jackets and ball caps bearing patches from wars decades apart. But all eyes drifted to the man sitting at the defendant's table, Benjamin Dawson. He sat, as he always did, composed upright, his hands folded calmly on the table. The only sign of emotion was the subtle movement of his thumb, brushing gently along the edge of his folded coat beside him, like a ritual meant to anchor him in a place he didn't belong. Next to him, Claire Donovan shuffled papers with barely contained frustration. Her emergency motion to vacate the contempt charge had been denied without formal hearing. Her transfer request had been ignored. Judge Trent Alberson entered through the side door with a self-satisfied expression. He sat a little taller today. There were cameras in the room, not from the press, but cell phones, propped discreetly behind handbags and notebooks. He welcomed the attention. He liked being watched. The court will now resume proceedings in the matter of State of Washington versus Dawson. He began tapping the gavel once. This hearing concerns the enforcement of a contempt penalty previously levied and the psychological evaluation ordered by this court. Claire stood immediately. Your Honor, once again, we object to the necessity of any psychological assessment. My client has demonstrated no erratic behavior. His only violation was refusing to remove a military coat worn in silence and respect. Alberson raised a brow. Is that what we're calling it? Now, silence and respect. He leaned forward, voice dripping with condescension. Miss Donovan, do you know how many cases I see every week where individuals try to use the uniform of our armed forces as a shield from responsibility? Ben finally spoke, his voice steady. You don't know what I shielded with that uniform. The room fell still. Alberson glared. Excuse me. Ben didn't repeat himself. Claire placed a hand lightly on his arm, reminding him that some battles weren't worth fighting with words. Alberson leaned back and made a show of flipping through a file that had already been read. Mr. Dawson, per the court's recommendation, you will be scheduled for evaluation at Northwood Behavioral Clinic next Monday. Failure to comply will result in contempt, escalation, and potential detainment. Do you understand these terms? Ben nodded once. I understand the words. I question their purpose. The judge's jaw tightened. You are dangerously close to another charge, Mr. Dawson. Before Claire could object, the door to the courtroom creaked open. The sound wasn't loud, barely audible, but something about it turned every head. 2 military officers in dress uniform entered, stepping in precise unison heels, clicking sharply on the tile floor. They didn't speak, didn't scan the crowd. They parted at the aisle, and between them stepped General Dana Brooks, 4 stars on her shoulders, medals gleaming beneath crisp lapels, expression cold, composed, and devastatingly focused. A hush swept the room. Even Alberson mid-sentence froze. The gavel, once wielded with arrogant ease, now hung limp in his grasp. Dana walked slowly down the center aisle. The soft rustle of her uniform seemed louder than the audience's collective breath. She reached the defendant's table and stopped. Without a word, she turned toward Ben Dawson, standing at attention. Then, in one sharp, deliberate motion, she saluted. Not out of courtesy, not out of protocol, out of respect. Sergeant Major Dawson, she said, her voice ringing with clarity. It is an honor to stand in your presence again. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's pen clattered to the floor. A veteran in the back removed his cap and stood without being told. Ben returned the salute, eyes steady. Hello, Dana. It's been a long time. Dana turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said formally, "I am General Dana Brooks, Commander of Joint Special Operations Task Force Pacific. I am here on direct authorization from the Department of Defense." Alberson cleared his throat. "General, this is a civilian courtroom? We were not informed of any." Dana held up a sealed envelope with the red Omega classified stamp. "That's because the department does not ask permission to correct a disgrace. It acts." Claire could barely breathe. Neither could half the room. Dana continued opening the document and placing it firmly on the judge's bench. "This man is not a fraud. He is a decorated veteran of operations most will never hear about. Medal of Honor. Nominee, Silver Star recipient, former Delta Force Field Commander." She stepped closer. Her voice dropped but lost none of its steel. "And he's the reason I'm alive today." Alberson looked down at the papers, pages of commendations, citations, and deployment records buried under years of clearance restrictions. He blinked. His voice, once so proud, cracked. Why wasn't any of this on file?" "Because men like Sergeant Dawson don't seek attention," Dana said. "They serve. Then they disappear until someone drags them into the light for ridicule." She turned back to Ben. "I would have come sooner. But the system he defended with his life has a long memory and a short spine." The silence was electric. Ben looked down briefly, then met the judge's gaze. "I didn't come here for recognition, just to fix a traffic ticket." Dana's lips curled into the faintest smile, and ended up reminding a courtroom what honor looks like. Ethan, sitting quietly beside his father, reached out and took his hand. His grip was small, but certain. A murmur of reverence spread through the gallery. Not applause, not outrage, just a collective sense that something sacred had just happened. Something true. Alberson looked like a man drowning in his own robe. He couldn't seem to speak, couldn't lift the gavel, couldn't remember how to maintain control. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't the highest authority in the room. For one long, suspended moment, no one moved. Not the bailiff, not the stenographer, not even the judge. The room that had once laughed at Benjamin Dawson now sat, frozen, caught in the gravity of 4 silver stars and the silent reverence they brought with them. General Dana Brooks remained at full attention, her right hand still raised in salute. Sharp, precise, unwavering. It wasn't a political gesture. It wasn't for show. It was a soldier's vow, given publicly and witnessed by everyone in the room. Ben didn't flinch. He slowly rose from his seat and returned the salute with equal precision, not with pride, but with purpose. His back straightened, his eyes locked forward, and for the first time since he entered this courtroom, his uniform of silence gave way to presence. Behind him, his son Ethan rose to his feet, without understanding protocol, only that something sacred was happening, and that it had everything to do with his father. Dinah lowered her arm, her voice soft but steady. "Sergeant Major Dawson, I never forgot that day in Fallujah, and I never forgot you. We all carried pieces of that war, but I carried mine home because of you." Ben gave the smallest nod. "I only did what any of us would have done." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. But only one of us actually did." The gallery was silent, the cameras still rolling from phones tucked into pockets, and purses now captured something no algorithm could predict, the sound of honor being remembered. Claire Donovan sat in stunned silence, her heart swelling with vindication. She had believed in Ben without knowing why, and now truth had arrived not with anger, but with salute. From behind the defense table, District Attorney Thomas Reed stood slowly, his mouth half open. He looked from Dana to Ben, then down at the contempt order still sitting in his file. It suddenly felt like a disgrace, like a scarlet letter of bureaucratic blindness. He took a hesitant step forward. "General Brooks," he said, his voice respectful, but unsure the Department of Defense doesn't usually intervene in civil court cases. "May I ask?" "Why now?" Dana turned toward him, her tone calm but clipped. "Because silence becomes complicity when good men are humiliated for the truth they've lived." She then turned to the judge. "This court mocked a man whose actions saved lives the nation doesn't even know it owes. You may be within your legal rights, but legal isn't always right." Alberson's face had lost its earlier flush of arrogance. He looked more like a man grasping for footing on a slope that had collapsed beneath him. I wasn't aware of the classification," he muttered. "There were no records, no formal VA submissions. Nothing came through the court's verification system." Dana stepped closer. "Because he didn't ask for benefits. He didn't ask for fanfare. He asked for dignity, and he was met with suspicion." Alberson opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Ben stepped forward, his voice even. "Your Honor, I came here to settle a traffic ticket. What followed was unexpected. But let me be clear, I didn't wear my coat to make a statement. I wore it because it's mine, because it reminds me of the men and women who didn't come home." He looked toward Ethan. "And because I wanted my son to see me as I am not, as the world assumes I should be." Ethan's eyes welled, but he stood tall, chin raised. For the first time in his life, the world saw what he'd always known. His father wasn't invisible. He was irreplaceable. Dana looked toward the judge. "With your permission, I'd like to submit a formal acknowledgement of Sergeant Dawson's service signed by the Secretary of Defense and request this court remove any and all charges including contempt," Claire added firmly, "and file a motion to seal this hearing from public record to protect his classified background." Alberson, a man so used to commanding the room, now simply nodded. "Granted," he said quietly. The gavel in his hand looked heavier than ever. When he struck it, it no longer sounded like power. It sounded like closure. "Case dismissed. All charges expunged," he said. A collective exhale filled the room. Not applause, not celebration. Just release. Dana turned back to Ben and extended a hand. "You're owed a great deal more than this," she said. "But sometimes, the smallest victories are the ones that echo longest." Ben looked to Ethan. The boy nodded with a smile so quiet, it said more than any speech ever could. "I didn't need victory," Ben said. "I just needed my name." Outside the courthouse, the flag rippled in the wind, this time noticed. Ben stepped onto the sidewalk with Ethan at his side. Claire followed a few steps behind, overwhelmed by the surreal weight of the day. Ethan looked up. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." "Was that lady a general?" Ben smiled. "She still is. Why'd she salute you?" Ben looked at him, eyes soft but proud. "Because once a long time ago I stood up when others couldn't. And sometimes the people who remember that come back to remind you who you really are." Ethan considered that for a long moment. "I think you're my general," he whispered. Ben didn't respond. He just pulled his son close. And for the first time in weeks, he let himself believe not in medals, or courts, or orders, but in something far greater. That truth, when carried with humility, never needs to shout. The courtroom had officially been dismissed, but no one had left. The benches remained filled. The gallery was hushed, reverent. The cameras had long been turned off, not by order, but by instinct. This wasn't a spectacle anymore. This was a memorial to something unseen, something Americans feel, but rarely witness honor reclaimed. Judge Alberson remained seated on the bench, his posture changed. The once rigid lines of command now sagged with something unfamiliar to him, humility. He cleared his throat. "If the court may indulge one final request before adjournment," he said, looking toward General Dana Brooks, we invite you to place on the record what the Department of Defense deems appropriate. This court will honor it." Claire Donovan turned to Ben. He didn't speak. He just gave a slow, quiet nod. Dana stepped forward, removing a sealed folder from the black briefcase an aide had placed on the defense table. She opened it without dramatics. She didn't need theatrics. The weight of the words would speak for themselves. She looked toward the gallery, then directly at Ethan. "What I'm about to read was classified for nearly 2 decades, she said. Not to hide wrongdoing, but to protect operations' identities and the fragile peace our soldiers fought to preserve. But today, the cost of silence is greater than the risk of truth." She took a deep breath and began. Sergeant Major Benjamin Edward Dawson, U.S. Army, served with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, colloquially known as Delta Force, from 1998 to 2009. His operations were conducted in over 17 countries under high-risk, non-official cover status. Murmurs flickered across the gallery. Alberson looked up, stunned. Donna continued. In 2004, during Operation Black Dust, a covert rescue mission in Fallujah, Sergeant Major Dawson led a 5-man team behind enemy lines to extract a downed intelligence unit. The extraction involved penetrating hostile zones, without air cover, no GPS, and under imminent mortar fire. Her voice did not waver, but her eyes glistened. 12 American personnel were recovered. One of them was me. She paused. For a second, the silence in the room grew spiritual. In the course of that mission, Sergeant Major Dawson sustained injuries to his ribs and right leg, but continued leading the mission on foot for 19 hours. He refused evacuation. He refused recognition. Instead, upon successful return, he requested an immediate discharge, citing moral exhaustion and a need to serve peace through law, not war. Now it was Claire's turn to wipe a tear from her cheek. Dana's voice dropped quieter now. For this mission, and others classified under Omega clearance, Sergeant Dawson was awarded the following, though most were never publicly acknowledged. The Medal of Honor classified, and not formally bestowed. The Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Defense Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Purple Hearts, and 5 letters of personal commendation from 3 Secretaries of Defense and 1 President of the United States. She closed the folder gently. Then she looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the man before you is not a fraud. He is a ghost of our nation's finest work, the kind of man who serves, then vanishes, so the rest of us may live in peace." Alberson sat back, his face pale. His lips parted, but without words. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. Dana turned to Ben. "You told me once that the price of survival was silence," she said. "But I think silence has taken enough from you." Ben stood slowly. His hands were steady, his shoulders squared, but his voice, when it came, held the weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long. "I never wanted an audience," he said quietly. "I just wanted my son to know that his father didn't run." He looked down at Ethan, who now clutched the notebook to his chest. The words, "I believe my dad," still visible on the inside cover. Ben continued, his voice thick but clear. "Everything I did so. He wouldn't have to. So he could live in a country where he wouldn't need to prove his worth with blood." The room didn't move. Dana stepped back beside him. Claire placed a supportive hand on his arm. Even D.A. Thomas Reed, standing near the prosecution table, nodded solemnly. Finally, Alberson rose. He cleared his throat and addressed the room no longer as the judge in charge, but as a man standing in witness to something greater than himself. "This court regrets its blindness," he said quietly, "and offers apology, not as formality, but as admission. He turned to Ben. "Sergeant Major Dawson, your presence in this courtroom has reminded us all that justice must be humble to be real. On behalf of this institution, I thank you, and I vow that your name will never again be associated with doubt." A wave of solemn respect swept the room. A few men in the gallery, Vietnam veterans, judging by their jackets, rose to their feet and saluted. And one by one, the room followed. No one gave the order. No one asked for it. But the standing of those who had served gave permission for the rest to stand too. Ethan looked around wide-eyed. People were standing for his dad. He looked up and whispered, "They see you now." Ben placed a hand on his son's shoulder and whispered back, "They always did. They just didn't know what they were looking at." Outside, as they left the courthouse, the air was crisp with late autumn calm. Reporters waited at a respectful distance. No shouts, no microphones shoved forward. Just lenses pointed with quiet reverence. Ethan held his father's hand tightly. As they descended the stairs, someone in the crowd started clapping. It wasn't loud at first, just one man, then another, then a few more. By the time they reached the sidewalk, the applause had grown, not thunderous but steady, like the sound of 1,000 hearts finally hearing something they'd forgotten how to recognize. Dignity. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The cameras were gone. The murmuring crowd had dissolved into a respectful silence beyond the courthouse doors. The echo of footsteps and the low murmur of bailiffs preparing for the next session were all that remained. Judge Trent Alberson sat alone at the bench. The thick oak gavel rested unused before him. His hands lay folded atop a folder. The folder, the one stamped Department of Defense. Omega classified, now unsealed. Its contents were undeniable, and yet it wasn't the citations or military jargon that unsettled him. It was the look on Ben Dawson's face, not when the general walked in, not even when the medals were read aloud. But when the apology came, Alberson had delivered it as sincerely as he could voice, lowered eyes meeting Ben's. But Ben didn't look triumphant. He didn't gloat or smirk or even nod. He simply stood there, still composed, the way a mountain stands after a storm, unchanged at the core. And that more than anything humbled the judge. There was a knock at his chamber door. "Come in," Alberson said quietly. The door opened, and Claire Donovan stepped inside, a thick folder of motions in one hand. "I won't stay long," she said. "Just thought you should see this." She placed a document on his desk. He read the title aloud. "Motion to dismiss with prejudice all civil penalties. Benjamin E. Dawson." "I'll sign it," Alberson said, reaching for his pen. It should have been dismissed the moment he walked through that door. Claire nodded, then paused. "Can I ask you something, Judge?" He didn't look up. "You want to ask me how I didn't see it? How I could look a man like that in the eye and still doubt?" "Yes," she said. "Because if someone with your experience missed it, what chance do the rest of us have?" Alberson leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I didn't miss it," he said finally. "I saw him. I saw the way he carried himself, the stillness, the patience. I just didn't know what it meant." He looked up at her. "I mistook humility for weakness. And when he didn't fight back, I saw it as guilt. Because somewhere along the way, I started believing the loudest person in the room was the most trustworthy." Claire didn't respond right away. Finally, she said, "We all lose our way sometimes." Alberson gave a dry chuckle. He didn't. Claire smiled softly. "No." He didn't. As she turned to leave, Alberson called after her. "Miss Donovan." She paused. "Thank you," he said, "for standing up when I didn't." Claire nodded once, then stepped out into the corridor, leaving the judge to sit with something new and unfamiliar, the weight of a lesson learned too late, but not too lost. Downstairs, Ben and Ethan walked quietly through the courthouse lobby. The reporters had moved across the street, now respectfully distant. A few older men, some in military dress, others in faded flannel with combat patches sewn onto the shoulders, stood silently in a loose formation near the exit. One gave a slight nod as Ben passed. Ben returned it the way soldiers do, wordlessly, with meaning packed into a glance. Ethan looked up at his dad. "Did that judge ever say sorry to you?" Ben paused. "Yes," he said. "Did you forgive him?" Ben didn't answer right away. He reached for the door and held it open for Ethan. Outside, the air was cool. Not cold, just the kind that wakes you up. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Ben finally answered. "I didn't forgive him for him," he said. "I forgave him for us." Ethan looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Ben crouched down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If I carried his mistake with me, it would become mine. And then I'd hand that burden down to you without even knowing it." Ethan thought about that. "I don't want to carry someone else's mistake." Ben smiled. "Exactly." They kept walking. Ahead, a small crowd had gathered outside the community center across the street. A veteran support organization had set up tables with coffee flyers and a sign reading, "We stand for those who stood for us." Ben recognized a few faces, familiar but faint. He'd treated them with respect. At the local clinic, helped them navigate veterans' claims or discharge paperwork when no one else would. He'd never told them about himself, just listened, helped, moved on. Now they were there for him. He and Ethan crossed the street. Someone handed him a cup of coffee. Another clapped him gently on the shoulder. "You held the line, brother," one man said. Ben nodded. "No, I just didn't let go." Ethan sat at the edge of the sidewalk, notebook in his lap. He began to draw again. This time he sketched a gavel cracked in two, and beneath it a soldier, standing with a child's hand in his. At the top of the page he wrote, "Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that waits to speak last." Back in his chambers, Alberson finally rose from his bench. He walked to the far corner of the room, where a dusty frame hung half forgotten, a certificate of service from his days as a junior attorney in the Army Legal Corps. He took it down. For the first time in years, he looked at it not with pride, but with resolve. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up the phone, dialed the State Commission on Judicial Ethics, and requested a formal internal review of his conduct. Not because anyone had demanded it, but because no one did. And that was exactly the problem. The photograph appeared on a local news website 2 hours after the hearing ended. It was grainy, slightly off-center, clearly taken from a phone. But it didn't need polish, because it had truth. In the image, General Dinah Brooks stood at attention in a packed courtroom mid-salute. In front of her was a man in plain clothes, folding his hand to his brow, in return, modest, grounded still. Beside him stood an 11-year-old boy in sneakers and a jacket too big for his frame, looking up with eyes full of pride. The caption was short, "General salutes single dad in court." Turns out he's a hero. Within 24 hours, the photo went viral. Not in the way celebrity gossip does, not like scandal or outrage, but like a prayer, shared, quiet, reverent, deeply needed. In a small cafe in Montana, a Vietnam veteran named Ray sat with tears in his eyes, his coffee going cold. He hadn't spoken of his service in years. That morning he printed the article and pinned it to the wall of the VFW hall with a thumbtack and a shaking hand. In a high school in Ohio, a teacher used the story for a civics discussion on valor and humility. A student in the back, whose father had been deployed for most of his childhood, raised his hand and simply said, "That's what real strength looks like." In South Carolina, a 70-year-old widow wrote a letter to her local paper, saying her late husband, a Green Beret, had once mentioned a man named Dawson, who carried more than any man should. She thought it might be him. At Arlington, a small group of soldiers left a single American flag folded atop a headstone. A note was tucked beneath it, for the ones who came back quiet, and the one who finally spoke. But for Ben Dawson, none of that mattered as much as getting back to normal. The day after the hearing, he returned to the small community legal aid office, where he volunteered part-time helping veterans, single moms, and seniors navigate paperwork and court forms most people found too confusing to bother with. He didn't mention the photo. Neither did the receptionist, though she looked at him differently now. Not with awe, with understanding. A quiet respect that said, "We always wondered why you never talked about yourself. Now we know you didn't need to." Ethan went back to school that same week. When he walked into his classroom, no one teased him. No one whispered. Instead, Mrs. Langley had printed his notebook page, the one that read, "I believe my dad," and placed it in a small frame on the wall near the American flag. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. During recess, Marcus, the same kid who had mocked Ethan weeks ago, sat beside him on the swings. "My uncle saw the video," he mumbled. "He said your dad's the realest kind of hero." Ethan kicked at the dirt. "He's just my dad." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, that's the best part." At the Northwood Courthouse, Judge Trent Alberson sat through his first ethics review with quiet resolve. He didn't deflect. He didn't excuse. He said something rare for a man in his position. "I was wrong. I failed to recognize the cost of my words, not just legally, but humanly." The review board hadn't expected humility. That made them listen closer. Claire Donovan, meanwhile, was promoted. Word of her conduct during the hearing reached the state bar and the governor's office, but she didn't celebrate the recognition. Instead, she used the attention to launch a new program, free legal support for veterans navigating unjust charges, fines, and systemic obstacles. She named it Dawson's Shield. Ben was mortified when he found out, but Claire just smiled and said, "You taught us something no ruling ever could." As for General Dana Brooks, she returned to Fort Lewis. She made no public statements. She didn't appear on the morning shows. She refused all interviews. But a quiet internal memo was distributed across Joint Command the following week, a directive from her desk. Effective immediately protocol restrictions regarding veteran identity suppression, post-clearance, should be re-evaluated for humanitarian exceptions. We do not abandon the ghosts who served us, not in silence, not in shame. She attached one photo to the memo, a child holding his father's coat. A week later, Ben took Ethan to the park. It was a Saturday. Crisp air, the kind that hinted at winter, but still smelled like fall. They brought peanut butter sandwiches and sat on the same bench they had sat on many times before. Before the court, before the photo, before the salute. They watched the ducks in silence. Ethan finally said, "Are people still talking about it?" Ben shrugged. "Some are." "Do you care?" Ben looked at his son. "No," he said. "I care that you remember. That's enough." Ethan nodded, then pulled a small object from his backpack. It was a lapel pin, a tiny eagle clutching a sword. A replica of the Delta insignia his father once wore. "I got it from the bookstore with my allowance," he said. "Thought maybe you could wear it. Not because they know who you are, but so I remember." Ben held it gently between his fingers. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he pinned it on the inside of his jacket just above his heart, where no one could see it but him. Perfect place for it, he said. That night, as they prepared for bed, Ethan paused at the hallway closet. "Dad, yeah, can I wear your coat one day?" Ben looked over. Maybe he said with a smile, "When you've earned your own?" Ethan smiled, then said something that made Ben pause. "But I don't want medals." "No. No," Ethan said, crawling into bed. "I just want to live like you do. Quiet. But real." Ben stood there, silent. Then he turned out the light. And in the dark, with only the sound of wind brushing the windows, He whispered to the night and maybe to the ghosts, "That's the greatest honor I've ever been given." It was Sunday evening in Northwood. The sun began its slow descent behind the trees, casting warm amber light over the backyard of a modest two-bedroom home on the edge of town. The air was still save for the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. In the center of the yard stood Ben Dawson and his son, Ethan, facing a small wooden flagpole that had been repainted just last spring. At the top, a freshly laundered American flag swayed lightly in the wind, edges, crisp colors vivid. They stood side by side, as they had every Sunday evening for the past 2 years, preparing to lower the flag and fold it with care. It had become a quiet ritual between them, one Ethan had insisted on starting after learning about flag etiquette in school. But this evening the moment felt heavier. Not solemn, just full. Ethan held one end of the flag as Ben gently loosened the halyard and began to lower it. The stripes dipped toward the grass, then rose again as they guided it down together. Ben's hands were steady. Ethan's were learning. Once the flag was free, they began folding 12 precise triangles. No wrinkles, no rush. The way Ben had been taught years ago by a man whose name had long since faded from memory, but whose discipline never had. When they reached the final fold, Ben pressed the sharp edge of the triangle flat and handed it to Ethan. "You did that perfectly," he said. Ethan smiled. "You always say that." "That's because it's always true." They walked in silence toward the small patio, where a wooden storage chest waited. Ethan placed the flag inside carefully, as if tucking it in for the night. Then he turned hands in his pockets, eyes distant. "Dad," he said quietly. "Yeah, can I ask you something kinda?" Big Ben sat down on the porch step, motioning for his son to join him. "Always." Ethan took a breath. "How do you know who deserves respect?" Ben looked out across the yard. It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the years, in deserts, jungles, and cities, in war zones and courtrooms, in silence and in screams. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Well, he said it's easy to respect people when they wear shiny things, badges, uniforms, fancy titles. But those things, they don't always mean the person inside deserves it." Ethan frowned. "So how do you tell the difference?" Ben smiled softly. "By how they treat people who don't wear any of that." He let the words sit for a moment, then added, "Respect isn't something people earn by telling you who they are. They earn it by showing you who they are when no one's watching, when they don't think it matters, when there's nothing in it for them." Ethan nodded slowly, then asked, "Like how the judge talked to you?" Ben paused. "Yes, and how you talked to him back." Ben smiled again, faintly this time. "Exactly." Ethan looked down at the deck, thinking hard. "So, did you respect him?" Ben hesitated. Then he said something he never thought he'd say. "I didn't respect what he did, but I respected that he came back to own it. Most people in power never do that." They sat in quiet for a few beats. Ethan pulled his knees up to his chest. At school, some kids still bring up the video. Not in a bad way. Just like it's a story. Like you're famous. Ben chuckled. "I'm not. That moment was never about being known." Then what was it about? Ben looked at him. Really looked at him. "You," he said. "It was always about you." Ethan blinked. "Me, I wanted you to see what it looks like to stand for something quietly, to hold your ground without shouting, to know who you are even when others don't." He reached over and gently tapped the center of Ethan's chest. "That's where your medals go," he said. "Right in here. Not for what you fight, but for what you carry with grace." Ethan didn't answer. He just leaned his head against his dad's shoulder. They sat that way for a long time. No words, no sound, but the breeze brushing the tall grass and the last birds of daylight heading west. At some point, Ethan whispered, "One day, if I'm a dad, I want to be like you." Ben closed his eyes. That was the medal. Right there. That was the one no one could forge or fake or mock or take away. It had no ribbon, no frame, no military issue. Just a boy's voice in the twilight speaking from the purest place a heart can grow. He wrapped an arm around his son. "You already are," he said. Inside the house, the evening news droned quietly in the background. A segment aired about a new legal initiative inspired by the Dawson hearing. Interviews with veterans. A new scholarship named in his honor. A tribute wall being built in a community center. Ben didn't watch. He didn't need to. His legacy didn't live in articles or applause. It lived in the boy beside him, in the folded flag, in the silence between moments where character is passed down like a folded coat worn, yes, but earned. That night, as Ethan slept, Ben stood at the window, arms crossed. The stars above were crisp and clear. One in particular burned a little brighter than the others. He raised his hand in a quiet, invisible salute, not to the sky, not to a memory, but to a life still unfolding. To the idea that the smallest hands often carry the greatest truths. To the belief that dignity never shouts and respect begins at home. And as the house settled into silence and the world forgot its noise for a while, Benjamin Dawson did something rare. He allowed himself peace. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Feel free to share your city or country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss more true-to-life stories that honor courage, kindness, and quiet strength. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We hope this story reminded you, as it reminded us, that dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.